Guten Erev Shabbos, and welcome to Kehillat Shari Torah's virtual Shabbat Drasha for Parshas Pinchas. Our Parsha this week features a peaceful transition of power. There's no war, no fight for succession. In fact, designation of a successor even before crunch time, even before it's necessary. As Moshe Rabbeinu learns that the days of his life will soon come to a close, he names Joshua, Yehoshua, as the officially designated next leader of the Jewish people. He places his hands on him in full view of the people and instructs him as God commanded. Now, first let's examine the most essential, the mission-critical part of leadership, without which any leadership effort, no matter how good, is ultimately in vain. And that is the idea of followership. You can't have a leader if you don't have followers. Ein melech below am is the way Rabbeinu Bachai puts it. He's often quoted. You can't have a sovereign without people to reign over. If the people are not willing to give their loyalty, their acclamation to the king or the queen, you don't have a sovereign, you have a tyrant. Probably those of us who remember the 20th century have a little bit of a warped view of leadership. If we think of some of the leaders we've heard of or read about, many of them were probably tyrants of one form or another. When we think about followership, this is actually a very important, a critical piece of the puzzle. One of the first images of those despots that comes to mind is that stadium full of 100,000 people with the gymnasts doing all their synchronized dancing in the middle in the field, while all the people hold those cards over their head at the right time that spell out the great leader's name or something like that. Then we also have that image of those old men standing on top of the Kremlin, on top of Lenin's tomb, with their little gray hats and their overcoats, while that whole parade of goose-stepping troops with tanks and rockets and banners marches by. The 20th century had its dark moments, no question about it. Really, though, those kinds of fanatically loyal and usually forced examples of followership are just that. Healthy, productive, positive followership happens when the leaders inspire and model and bring out the best in people, encourage them to innovate, to participate, to feel like they have a part in something good, something that's larger than themselves. Not by erasing their individual identities, but by finding their individual place in a larger society. That's the best model. And the truth is that's where most of us fit in this paradigm. Most of us are not prime ministers, generals, or CEOs. We're not necessarily the ones issuing the orders. We're the ones carrying them out, hopefully. In the best of circumstances, teamwork, willing participation, enthusiasm, commitment, and loyalty, those are the important ingredients in the mix. And yet, how leaders inspire these qualities in us tells us a lot about them and about ourselves also. Truth is, you can always find people who are willing to follow anything. Maybe that's why Chumash B'Midbar, this whole book of Numbers that we're in the middle of reading, gives us some very flawed examples of leadership before showing us a better model. We had Korach, who was a rebel. There's always some people who are disgruntled enough to follow with the revolution, with the revolutionary leader, however ill-fated it is. Even before that, we had the spies, the Meragalim in Parsha Shalach. They were, as it happened, hand-chosen leaders. In fact, a head of each tribe. And they were supposed to scout out the mission, their mission was to scout out the land of Israel. But they suffered from mission creep, as we call it, and they forgot to focus just on their task of reconnaissance. They got caught up in their own opinions and views, and putting those forward to the dismay and distress of the entire Jewish people. And it's thanks to them we have Tisha B'Av. Thanks, spies. And if you recall later in that same Parsha Shalach, we had a small incident very briefly described of the Ma'apilim, we call them, the group who heard that the journey to Israel was now going to take an additional 40 years. And they had no patience for that. They didn't want to wait. So they said, we're going in now. We leave tomorrow. Ignoring warnings that they were not going to be successful, they set out for Israel right away and were stopped in their tracks by the Amalekites and the Amorites. If it's not time, it's not time. Yehoshua's story, Joshua's story, is a different one. He was certainly experienced. He was one of those 12 spies who went on that original ill-fated mission in Parsha Shalach. Notably, he was one of the two who did not come back with a dark and dreary gloom and doom report. In fact, he joined his buddy Caleb in saying that the land was quite good, and with God's help, we would be able to settle and to inhabit the land of Israel. They're threatened with violence by a hysterical mob of anxious Israelites, so Yehoshua definitely knew what he was getting into when he agreed to take on the post as Moshe's successor. Now, it's a real mark of leadership on Moshe's part to recognize the need for a succession plan before it's time to exit stage right. In our days, it seems like some of the nations of the world, without mentioning names, put all their eggs in the basket of staying in office rather than planning to pass the torch and finding a successor to whom it's appropriate to pass that torch. In our Tehillim study group, we noted a few weeks back how David HaMelech, King David, even composed a psalm when he was deposed from the throne. He wrote, "If this is what God wants, I'm for it too." Rather than cling to office by their fingernails, the most forward-looking leaders anticipate. They know the day will come when their own sun will set over the horizon and the next generation will take over. One of the collections of Medrash that we look at from time to time, Yalkut Shimoni, says this. It says, "Before the righteous die, they set aside their own needs for the needs of the community." This actually frames Moshe's being informed by his boss that his time is drawing near quite appropriately. So Moshe asks for help, and he says, "God of the souls of all flesh, appoint a leader over the Eidah, over the whole congregation." Rashi explains that wording. He says, "Shiyeh yodea lelechas neged rucho shel kol echad ve'echad." This leader should be able to match every soul. In a sense, this can mean that the leader has to be able to tolerate everyone's views. When it says neged rucho, that can mean matching or parallel. It could also mean against, or matching all the negative tendencies of the people. Chassam Sofer says this is a risk, and it means that a leader has to lead them actually, and not be led by them. He has to set the agenda, not let others force their agendas on him. But Rashi seems to mean that the leader has to be able to tolerate the views of everyone, treating everyone with love and concern. Remember Moshe's resume before he got this job. He was a shepherd, one whose first and only task is to look after and to protect and to worry about each and every single shepsela in the flock. So Moshe sort of has to brief Yehoshua on what's needed at this new moment in Jewish history. After 40 years of the desert, going into the land of Israel, he's going to have to serve the people even as he leads them, bear their burdens with them, and be an empathetic and at the same time persuasive and impactful leader. Ramban, Nachmanides, has a different angle on this, and it's interesting to think about. Ramban says that Moshe had to instruct Yehoshua to be a firm and strong leader and not flinch from using his power to maintain the unity and the discipline of the nation. This is what was made known to everyone when Moshe publicly appoints Yehoshua as his successor. But Ramban adds, behind closed doors, or behind closed tent flaps, whatever it was, Moshe told Yehoshua how important tolerance and patience really is. So does this mean the leader has to be two-faced, duplicitous, says one thing and means another, does another? Maybe it's something even deeper, a little bit more spiritual, as we're being clued in here by the use of the word spirit, ruach. A man of spirit, says the Sforno, means that he can absorb and receive the splendor of the King of Kings, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem. This is fascinating because it suggests that in order to be a great leader, that leader starts out as a good follower. Yoshua has to be a follower. He's Moshe's follower, and ultimately he's Hashem's follower. In order to be, that being a follower, a good follower, is exactly what makes him into a good leader, at least according to this comment of Sforno. God says to Moshe, "V'nasata ma'odcha alav, leman yishmu kol adas b'nei Yisrael." Let's understand that to mean grant Yoshua, some of the glow that's on your face, so that the entire congregation of Israel can listen to him as they listen to you. That sounds a little bit like what we would call nowadays, when we're speaking about a leader that we like, usually, we would call that charisma. Charisma comes from a Greek word, charis, which means favor or grace, according to my Googling. And it seems to indicate sort of a divine gift. That's the glow that seems to be suggested in this passage, maybe, some kind of divine favor. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, says that's what it is. It's not a personal quality that you're a good speaker, you look good on TV. It's a spiritual gift to be root and soul for all the Jewish people. Moshe understood that he had a spiritual connection to each and every Jew because he was connected to something beyond himself. He was connected to God. He wanted that same quality for his successor also. I have a little souvenir on my bookshelf from visiting the Harry Truman Presidential Museum in Independence, Missouri. I love presidential museums. It's a replica, a little tiny pin of the desk sign that Truman very famously had on his desk in the White House. It says, everybody knows, "The buck stops here." In other words, obviously he took ultimate responsibility. He wasn't going to pass the buck on to anybody else. Now that's responsibility, which is good. And here we're talking about yet another dimension, another facet of leadership, responsibility, no question about it. And at the same time, it's the sense that it's not about the leader who's standing on top of Lenin's tomb at the parade, or on the 10-story high banners on the parade route, or on every poster. It's about something larger than that. It's about the ideals, the values, the goals of the nation. So it's very telling that God wanted Moshe to share with Yehoshua some of his hod, some of his glory. That's what the verse says. This quality of leadership that really, at least according to some of the commentators, had to do with followership also. That the leader, such as he or she is also a follower, in this case, a follower of Hashem, a follower of Hashem's Torah. Right? Keep in mind that just as Moshe's leadership would involve both politics and religion, in fact, there was very little distinction between them, the same and even more would be the case for Yoshua when he took the Jewish people into the land of Israel and conquered it and settled it, and they began living in it, farming it, working it, and establishing the first autonomous Jewish state. The new leader was not without some disappointment for at least some of the people, as is always the case. Hard to avoid that. Chassam Sofer writes that Moshe's charisma, his countenance is the term that he uses, was like the sun, and Yehoshua's was reflected glory, like the moon. On the one hand, people rejoiced because they saw Yehoshua as more one of them, a man of the people, more so than Moshe was. Remember, a lot of things to remember about Moshe. Remember, he grew up in a palace. He came to a position of leadership much later in life. Nobody knew him in the beginning. Yehoshua grew up with the Jewish people. He was really one of them. They would feel more comfortable with him. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that the elders who knew Moshe very well were a little disappointed that Yehoshua wasn't exactly the same in stature. Well, you know what they say, you can't please them all. But there's no question Yehoshua was the right leader for the time. He's the one who had the right combination of abilities to be able to lead Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, to be able to fight for their independence, to settle the land, and to make all the instructions of Torah about how to set up a society, how to care for the needy, the disadvantaged, how to make them not just a set of nice theories, nice ideas in a book somewhere, but make them into a living, breathing reality. We lost one whole generation of leaders in these last couple of weeks of Torah readings. We lost Moshe and Aaron and Miriam, not in that order. And thank God we were provided with just the appropriate leader for the next phase of our history, who was Yehoshua. So may we always be blessed with the leadership that we need to accomplish our mission and to live our fullest and best and holiest Jewish lives. Shabbat Shalom.